Leandro Montalban slammed the heavy leather binder onto the mahogany table, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently across the polished surface. He stood before the two women with a ghastly, pale complexion and a loosened tie, while the screens of their smartphones repeatedly flashed the exact same terrifying headline: Montalban Designs on the Brink of Bankruptcy. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a commercial flatbed truck was hauling away the last of his luxury sports cars, and two security guards were placing official-looking paper seals across the entrance of his home office. "I have lost the company, the estate, and every single cent to my name," Leandro announced, his voice hollow, cold, and calculated. "Whoever wants to leave, pack your bags and get out right now." Mireia Salcedo immediately covered her mouth, feigning a sudden burst of panicked distress that failed to reach her cold, calculating eyes. Inez Robledo, on the other hand, did not look at the looming floor-to-ceiling windows, nor at the original artwork, nor at the diamond jewelry resting on the side tables. She looked exclusively at her husband. Leandro slid a forged asset seizure order across the table, claiming that all bank accounts had been frozen. Corporate liquidity was at zero, and the estate was hours away from being repossessed by federal authorities. Then, from the upper floor of the grand residence, came the unmistakable sound of a heavy luggage zipper being pulled shut. For several agonizing seconds, no one in the grand foyer dared to breathe. Leandro slowly turned his head toward the winding staircase with a dark, bitter satisfaction. He was utterly convinced that Inez had rushed straight to the master bedroom to pack her designer clothes and abandon him in his hour of ruin. That was the exact answer he had spent weeks orchestrating, the definitive proof that would justify all his deep-seated cynicism and allow him to believe that genuine love always carried a steep price tag. However, the figure that emerged onto the marble landing was not his wife. Mireia was hurrying down the steps, clutching an ivory-colored leather suitcase, an expensive trench coat draped over her arm, and her leather handbag pressed tightly against her chest. She carefully avoided making eye contact with Inez, turning directly to Leandro with a shaky, rehearsed quiver in her voice. She claimed her mother had suddenly fallen ill, that she needed to leave immediately, and that she simply could not afford to get entangled in an ongoing federal financial investigation. Before stepping out, she unclasped a heavy diamond bracelet Leandro had secretly gifted her months prior, dropping it onto the marble console table as if she were returning a temporary hotel room key. The front door slammed shut, and its loud echo vibrated through the high ceilings like a final judicial sentence. Leandro stood frozen, completely robbed of speech. He had mentally rehearsed tears, furious accusations, and perhaps a dramatic goodbye speech from Inez, but he had never anticipated this frantic, immediate flight from Mireia, the woman who had spent months whispering in his ear that she would stand by his side even if the entire world turned against him. Inez quietly watched the ivory suitcase disappear through the glass doors. Then, she knelt down and picked up a single sheet of paper that had slipped out from Leandro's binder. She did not ask how much money remained in their personal accounts, whether they would be allowed to keep the house, or what would happen to their planned summer getaway to the Hamptons. She looked up and asked how many factory workers had received their payroll checks that Friday, and how many families depended on the operation of their manufacturing plants. Leandro swallowed hard and answered that perhaps more than 400 workers and their families faced immediate unemployment. Inez pressed her lips together, slowly unclasped her pearl earrings, and placed them gently right next to Mireia's abandoned diamond bracelet. "Then let's start by selling these," Inez said softly. That simple, quiet gesture instantly robbed Leandro of the cynical victory he had been seeking. Inez was not standing there to prove her romantic devotion to him. She was refusing to abandon 400 working-class people whom she had never even met. Her silence was not submission, and the absolute composure with which she requested access to the emergency payroll files felt far more unnerving than any tearful, dramatic scene. Why was a woman on the verge of losing everything thinking first about hourly workers? And why was the man who had manufactured this entire fake disaster suddenly terrified of the answer he was about to find? To understand how Leandro Montalban reached the point of placing his wife and his mistress through the exact same cruel trial, it was necessary to look back 3 weeks prior. 3 weeks earlier, the gleaming glass headquarters of Montalban Designs stood prominently over the bustling avenues of Midtown Manhattan, acting as a towering monument to absolute financial security. National business journals routinely featured Leandro as one of the most admired young executives in the country. At 35 years old, he had expanded his family's modest textile manufacturing business into a multi-million-dollar international design empire that seemed entirely unstoppable. Yet, behind the soundproof glass of his corner office, Leandro felt anything but invincible. He had spent the better part of that morning obsessively staring at high-resolution photographs from a recent charity gala in Greenwich. In almost every frame, Inez was pictured engaged in warm, animated conversations with maintenance staff, catering personnel, and local suppliers, while barely spending any time posing alongside the high-profile corporate investors. To anyone else, the images demonstrated a genuine, unassuming warmth. But to Leandro, whose worldview was warped by years of deep personal paranoia, it was a troubling puzzle he could not solve. His late father had spent his dying days repeatedly warning him that no one ever approached a Montalban without first calculating what they stood to gain. Leandro had sworn to himself that he would never become as bitter as his father, but he had unwittingly adopted the exact same distrust as his guiding philosophy. Mireia Salcedo understood that psychological vulnerability better than anyone. As the company's chief communications officer, she spent more hours with Leandro than any member of the executive board, and she possessed a masterclass ability to plant subtle doubts at just the right moment. She walked into his office carrying a media folder and casually displayed an old interview Inez had given right before their wedding, wherein she admitted she had never imagined living a life surrounded by immense wealth. Mireia offered a soft, seemingly innocent smile and remarked that certain people adapted to luxury far too quickly. Then, she casually dropped a rumor that Inez had been quietly inquiring about the total market value of a small residential property in upstate New York, hinting that his wife might be preparing a comfortable exit strategy. Leandro instinctively opened his mouth to defend his wife, but the words caught in his throat. What he did not know was that Inez was researching that specific property to transform it into a temporary shelter for victims of domestic abuse. Mireia knew this detail because she had personally intercepted an email addressed to Inez, but she intentionally withheld that piece of information. That evening, Leandro returned to their estate in Westchester earlier than usual. He found Inez sitting at the kitchen table with Ramona, an elderly former housekeeper who had recently been laid off by an outsourced cleaning agency. Inez was patiently helping Ramona fill out unemployment benefit forms and had already reached out to Nerea Valtierra, the head of human resources at Montalban Designs, to see if an entry-level position could be opened at the factory. When Inez saw her husband enter, she stood up, kissed his cheek, and calmly explained the situation. Leandro heard her words, but his mind remained entirely hyper-focused on Mireia's toxic, subtle hints. He viewed Inez's simple act of kindness as a calculated performance, a way to appear saintly in front of the domestic staff. When Ramona left, Leandro asked about the property in upstate New York. Inez replied that it was far too early to discuss the project, as she wanted to ensure she could fund it using her own modest personal savings before making any grand announcements. Her natural boundary, rooted in personal humility, was immediately registered by Leandro as suspicious secrecy. During dinner, sitting across a dining table that felt far too wide for the growing emotional distance between them, Inez brought up the manufacturing plant in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She mentioned that several line workers were complaining about forced, unpaid overtime and suggested that Leandro make an unannounced site visit to inspect the working conditions. Exhausted and feeling defensive, Leandro snapped, asking if she suddenly wanted to run the entire corporate board. Inez shook her head calmly, replying that she simply wanted to make sure that the people whose physical labor carried the Montalban name were being treated with basic human dignity. The statement should have moved him, but Leandro heard it as a direct threat to his leadership. When Inez retired to bed, Leandro remained alone in his study with an untouched glass of whiskey and opened a text message Mireia had just sent him. Women who truly love the man stay when his power vanishes. Women who only love the lifestyle start building their life rafts long before the ship hits the iceberg. Leandro read those words 3 times before dialing the personal cell phone of Dario Cifuentes. Dario arrived at the private study of the estate shortly before midnight. As the chief financial officer and one of Leandro's oldest friends, he was one of the very few people capable of telling Leandro when an idea was completely irrational. Though on this night, it took him several minutes to gather the courage to speak up. Leandro laid out a bizarre, elaborate scheme. They would manufacture a controlled financial crisis. They would temporarily freeze specific corporate accounts, move the luxury vehicles into a subsidiary holding firm, suspend personal credit cards, and leak deliberate rumors of an impending insolvency to a few select business journalists. Leandro insisted he had no intention of actually harming the business. He claimed he merely wanted to observe who remained by his side when the money appeared to vanish into thin air. "Are you telling me that Inez doesn't know she's being tested?" Dario asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "A test where the subject knows they are being watched is useless," Leandro replied firmly. "That isn't a test, Leandro. That's a psychological trap," Dario countered. Leandro invoked his authority as CEO, promising to limit the secret experiment to exactly 10 days and demanding total confidentiality. Dario reluctantly agreed, though an overwhelming sense of dread settled in his chest. The fake crisis began with subtle, silent details. Inez's credit card was unexpectedly declined at a local bookstore. The house driver politely informed her that one of the family SUVs had been sold off, and the property manager mentioned that household operating expenses needed to be cut immediately. Leandro braced himself for panicked questions and demanding confrontations, but Inez reacted by quietly canceling an upcoming charitable gala appearance, taking the suburban commuter train into the city, and instructing the kitchen staff to stop ordering expensive imported groceries. When her card failed a second time at a pharmacy, she called the bank strictly to confirm that her account hadn't been compromised by identity theft. Afterward, she asked Leandro if the company was experiencing financial strain and offered to transfer her modest personal savings into their joint account. Leandro gave evasive, vague answers, scrutinizing her every reaction like a cold prosecutor. That same afternoon, Mireia strolled into his corporate office holding 2 luxury real estate brochures for apartments in Paris. In a half-joking tone, she asked if it might be wise for him to transfer certain expensive gifts and assets under her name before any formal creditor claims were filed. Leandro experienced his very first jolt of harsh reality. Mireia instantly sensed his sudden emotional stiffness and altered her strategy. She quickly claimed she was only looking out for assets that could serve as a financial safety net for both of them in the future. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders and whispered that she would never abandon him, no matter what happened. Leandro forced himself to believe her, because admitting the alternative meant accepting that he had confused hollow ambition with genuine loyalty. Meanwhile, Inez visited the Scranton manufacturing plant alongside Nerea Valtierra, completely without media coverage or corporate fanfare. She sat in a break room and listened to a seamstress named Pilar explain that over time, pay had been delayed for 2 consecutive pay periods. She spoke with a machine operator who admitted he was afraid to report safety hazards for fear of immediate termination. Inez took detailed notes, gathered documentation, and promised to address these concerns directly with executive management. Nerea quietly warned her that the finance department had abruptly frozen operational budgets without explanation. While the sudden budget freezes aligned with the domestic cutbacks at home, Inez never once suspected a spousal fidelity test. She genuinely believed her husband was privately battling a massive corporate crisis and was trying to protect her from the stress. When Inez returned home that evening, she found Leandro staring blankly into the fireplace. She handed him her detailed notes from the factory, urging him to prioritize worker payroll over corporate public relations expenses. Leandro sighed, stating that they might soon have to initiate massive layoffs. Inez paused, took a slow breath, and reminded him that she had worked as a mid-level administrative assistant before they met. She knew how to audit operational budgets and offered to help restructure their overhead costs. Leandro flatly rejected her offer, terrified that if she looked at the actual corporate ledgers, she would instantly spot the artificial nature of the crisis. His harsh refusal sounded like pure contempt. "I don't need you to shield me from the truth, Leandro," Inez said, her voice laced with quiet pain. "I need you to let me stand beside you and face it with you." Leandro averted his eyes. He felt a sudden urge to end the absurdity right then and there, but a private text message from Mireia, inviting him to a late dinner, pulled him straight back into his web of deceit. At a private table in a Manhattan hotel, Mireia played on Leandro's deepest fears with practiced precision. She argued that Inez was simply adept at playing the humble victim because it protected her public image. According to Mireia, no woman willingly walked away from a Westchester estate, private drivers, and an elite social status without a fight. She then proposed a dramatic final act. Formally announced the company's total collapse in front of both women simultaneously and see who packed their bags first. Leandro initially recoiled at the sheer cruelty of the suggestion, but Mireia challenged him with a subtle, condescending smile. "Are you terrified to find out that I'm right about her?" she asked softly. That single question struck his fragile pride. Upon leaving the hotel, Leandro called Dario and ordered him to escalate the rumors. Dario fiercely warned him that real-world suppliers might react unpredictably, but Leandro foolishly insisted he could control the narrative. He failed to comprehend that certain lies, once put into motion, gain a momentum of their own. 2 days later, a prominent financial blog published a report claiming Montalban Designs was hiding millions in undisclosed debt. While the article didn't explicitly state the company was bankrupt, it was enough to trigger frantic calls from regional banks and international partners. Dario managed to stabilize a few major accounts, but a key European textile distributor abruptly canceled a major contract. For the very first time, Leandro felt a cold wave of panic. The experiment was rapidly spiraling out of control. Yet, when he arrived home and found Inez on the phone with Nerea, trying to personally guarantee funding for the factory worker daycare center, he pressed forward. Upon hanging up, Inez demanded a direct, honest answer. Leandro looked her dead in the eye and uttered the full lie. The company was ruined, and bankruptcy was inevitable. Inez grew pale, but she did not step back. "Did you do anything illegal?" she asked quietly. "No," Leandro lied. Inez reached out, took his hand in hers, and said softly, "If your integrity is intact, we can rebuild everything from scratch. Just please, do not abandon the people who trusted you." Leandro felt a deep spike of shame, but not enough to stop the machine he had built. Over the following days, he watched as Inez systematically cut every unnecessary personal expense. She listed 2 unworn designer dresses for sale online and contacted a local legal clinic that provided free debt counseling for working families. She wasn't attempting to salvage her personal reputation. She was trying to construct a safety net for 400 employees. Mireia, on the other hand, was quietly packing up her private apartment. She was surreptitiously removing designer clothing, high-end electronics, and expensive jewelry Leandro had bought her over the past year. She instructed a private headhunter to quietly inquire if a rival fashion conglomerate was looking for a new communications VP. When Dario noticed these unusual file downloads on the corporate network, he informed Leandro that Mireia was accessing sensitive company files. Blinded by his own narrative, Leandro rationalized her behavior, convincing himself she was merely gathering materials to help defend the firm. Dario stared at his boss with pure exhaustion. Leandro was demanding impossible levels of saintliness from his honest wife while granting endless excuses to the woman actively betraying him. The morning chosen for the final staged downfall arrived under a gloomy gray sky. Leandro ordered the removal of their remaining luxury sedan, dismissed the domestic staff, and hired 2 actors posing as legal process servers to stand in his home office. Inez personally helped Ramona and the estate gardener pack their belongings, paying them 2 weeks of severance out of her own modest checking account and promising to call them the second the situation stabilized. She didn't cry in front of them. Only when she was alone in the grand hallway did she press her forehead against the wall and close her eyes in quiet anguish. Leandro watched her through the cracked door of his study. For a brief second, he wanted to run out, wrap his arms around her, and confess everything. Then his phone buzzed with a message from Mireia. "I'm downstairs. Today, you finally find out who truly loves you." That chilling text reignited his cynicism. Leandro gathered both women in the drawing room, dropped the heavy binder onto the table, and made his dramatic announcement. The narrative returned to the exact moment the heavy front door slammed shut following Mireia's hasty departure. Inez picked up her pearl earrings from the console table, carefully slipping them into a small envelope to sell the following morning. Leandro stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly, as he told her there was no need to act so drastically. Inez turned to him with a profound, quiet sadness in her eyes. "The factory workers cannot feed their children on your vague promises, Leandro," she said softly. She then asked for the master keys to the payroll archive. Leandro stammered that Dario would handle everything, but Inez shook her head. "If we are going to lose this company," she said firmly, "we are going to do it while taking care of the people who built it." That statement was not a romantic declaration, and that was precisely why it cut Leandro to the bone. She wasn't staying to prove her devotion to him as a trophy husband. She was staying because she believed that a crisis reveals a person's fundamental moral duties. Leandro nodded silently, entirely incapable of admitting that the entire disaster was a cruel fabrication, and accompanied her to the modest sedan they still had access to. When they arrived at the Montalban Designs corporate headquarters, panic had fully gripped the building. Dozens of anxiety-ridden employees were clustered around the main bulletin board, where someone had posted an unverified list of sweeping job cuts. Seamstresses were weeping, warehouse workers were frantically calling their banks, and junior designers were asking if they would even receive their paycheck for the current month. Nuria was desperately trying to maintain order in the lobby while Dario was locked in his office, arguing heatedly with a supplier, demanding immediate cash collateral. When Inez walked through the glass doors, the room fell dead silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward her with a chaotic mixture of desperate hope and lingering resentment. Some assumed the CEO's wife had come to secure her own financial assets. Others expected her to deliver a scripted corporate speech. Inez calmly removed her coat, stepped onto a sturdy lobby chair, and raised her hands for attention. She didn't offer empty miracles. She stated honestly that she did not yet have all the financial answers, but promised that no single employee would be ignored, and that she would remain in the building until every single critical hardship case was personally reviewed. Leandro watched the entire scene unfold from the elevated glass walkway on the second floor. He had expected to see a fragile, desperate woman leaning on him for financial protection. Instead, he watched his wife methodically organize emergency worker committees, instruct Nuria to compile a list of families with immediate medical or housing needs, and order the corporate cafeteria to open its doors to provide free meals for staff who had been waiting for hours. Dario walked up beside Leandro, his phone still buzzing uncontrollably. He reported that the European distributor had officially terminated their contract. A major bank was calling in an immediate audit of their revolving line of credit, and 3 senior executives were threatening to resign by nightfall. "This isn't a game anymore, Leandro," Dario warned in a sharp whisper. "The fire you set to test your wife is burning down the actual house." Leandro didn't answer. Down in the brightly lit lobby, Inez happened to look up. Her eyes met his through the clear glass walkway. There was no rage in her expression yet, only a silent, devastating question. "Why aren't you down here facing these people with me?" By 9 o'clock that evening, the corporate lobby remained packed. Inez had systematically organized the workforce into priority groups: families with young children, workers managing elderly dependents, and temporary staff who lacked standard contractual severance protections. Nuria diligently logged every single file while answering a non-stop barrage of phone calls. When the third-party cafeteria manager refused to serve warm food due to unpaid corporate invoices, Inez pulled out her personal debit card and covered the entire evening's food bill out of her own pocket. The transaction processed smoothly because that private account was not part of the network Leandro had ordered Dario to simulate freezing. From the second-floor gallery, Leandro watched his wife hand plates of warm food to factory line workers whose names he had never bothered to learn. He had assumed that financial ruin would force her to realize how much she depended on his status. Instead, she seemed to have completely forgotten about her former life of luxury, pouring every ounce of her energy into serving others. Dario approached Leandro with a grave expression. He reported that 2 more domestic suppliers had halted raw material shipments. The controlled rumors had completely breached their intended boundaries. International clients were demanding legal guarantees. Local news outlets were picking up stories of internal chaos, and several employees had posted videos of the staged asset seizures online. Dario reminded Leandro that the secret experiment was supposed to last 10 days, but after just 4 days, the collateral damage to the brand was catastrophic. Leandro insisted that a single comprehensive press release would fix everything once the test was over. Dario slowly shook his head, pointing down to a young warehouse worker in the lobby, who was emotionally weeping while hugging his wife. "You can issue a press release to deny the bankruptcy, Leandro," Dario muttered bitterly. "But you will never be able to press release away the absolute terror you just put into these people's hearts." Leandro turned his gaze away, weakly replying that he only needed a little more time to fully understand if Inez was staying out of love or out of codependency. While the corporate headquarters burned with anxiety, Mireia Salcedo was relaxing in an executive suite at an airport hotel near JFK. She had intentionally chosen a location that offered a quick exit from New York if federal investigators or angry creditors started filing lawsuits. Spread across her king-sized bed were proprietary client lists, internal marketing strategies, and confidential design portfolios she had illicitly downloaded before fleeing the estate. She placed a call to a senior vice president at a major rival design firm. She claimed Montalban Designs was on the verge of total collapse and offered to hand over their top accounts in exchange for a high-paying executive position and full corporate legal protection. The executive on the other end was intrigued, but demanded a sample of the confidential files before making a commitment. Mireia immediately transmitted several pages of trade secrets. She then reached into her purse, pulling out the diamond bracelet she had pretended to leave behind on the console table. The item she had dropped at the estate was a cheap cubic zirconia replica. The genuine multi-carat diamond was safely tucked away in her coat. She felt zero remorse for abandoning Leandro. In her mind, terms like loyalty were simply fairy tales invented by people who lacked the leverage to negotiate a better deal. Leandro attempted to call Mireia 3 times before she finally answered. Her voice sounded faint, soft, and artificially strained, as if she had spent the entire afternoon crying at her mother's bedside. She claimed she needed time to gather her thoughts, insisting that her sudden exit from the estate was actually a clever move to protect Leandro's brand from being dragged through a public media circus. She claimed she was actively reaching out to wealthy contacts to secure an emergency private investment. When Leandro asked why she had packed a full suitcase, Mireia smoothly claimed she had only grabbed essential clothing to stay overnight at the hospital. Each explanation sounded plausible in isolation, yet none of them logically explained why she had quietly cleared out all her personal belongings from her private city apartment weeks earlier. Still, Leandro forced himself to believe her. Deep down, admitting she was lying meant accepting that his entire cynical test was a massive, tragic mistake. Upon hanging up, Leandro looked down into the lobby and saw Inez kneeling beside a crying factory worker whose child was facing an unexpected medical emergency. The stark contrast between the two women was blinding, yet Leandro's stubborn pride refused to admit how catastrophically he had misjudged his wife. Around midnight, Inez and Nuria moved the urgent worker files into a glass conference room. As they audited the accounts, they discovered alarming systemic issues. Dozens of line workers had logged hundreds of hours of unrecorded overtime over the past 6 months, and several internal employee assistance programs had been quietly defunded. Inez felt a heavy mix of righteous anger and deep shame. While she had been attending lavish gallery openings paid for by the firm, the very people whose hard work generated that wealth were being quietly squeezed. Nuria explained that she had submitted multiple internal reports regarding these labor issues, but the reports were consistently blocked before ever reaching Leandro's desk. Mireia had maintained strict control over internal corporate communications, systematically suppressing any negative operational data that might tarnish the company's pristine public image. Inez realized that the apparent perfection of the Montalban corporate empire had been built on a foundation of carefully enforced silence. She immediately proposed creating an emergency assistance fund using her personal savings and requested an immediate list of non-essential corporate expenses that could be liquidated to support the workforce. Nuria gently warned her that her personal savings wouldn't be enough to sustain a multi-million-dollar company's payroll for long. "It might not solve everything," Inez replied firmly, "but a few $1,000s right now can keep a worker from losing their home this Friday." The next morning, Inez took several of her personal heirlooms to a reputable jewelry dealer in Manhattan. She didn't just bring items Leandro had bought her during their marriage. She brought a vintage gold watch inherited from her grandmother and a delicate pearl necklace her mother had given her for her 26th birthday. The appraiser urged her not to sell under pressure, pointing out that liquidating high-value heirlooms so quickly meant accepting a fraction of their true worth. Inez didn't hesitate. She demanded immediate certified funds. With that money, she personally covered emergency prescription costs for 3 struggling worker families and funded a temporary hot meal program in the factory break rooms. When Leandro discovered what she had done, he experienced a sudden, unexpected surge of pride, immediately followed by a sharp, agonizing stab of guilt. He knew he had the power to end the fake crisis with a single phone call, restore her lost heirlooms, and admit that the entire insolvency was a lie. Yet, his deeply entrenched paranoia convinced him that he needed one final, absolute test to be entirely certain. He ordered Dario to draft an internal memo stating that the company would officially be unable to guarantee payroll for the upcoming month. For the very first time, Dario openly refused. He argued that publishing such a document would trigger mass resignations, severe labor lawsuits, and the permanent loss of top-tier talent. Leandro countered that the memo wouldn't be formally distributed. It would simply be placed in a file folder where Inez was guaranteed to see it. Dario realized with horror that Leandro was no longer seeking the truth. He was actively trying to push his wife to her breaking point just to satisfy his own psychological sickness. "She just sold her late grandmother's watch to feed your line workers, Leandro," Dario said, his voice shaking with anger. "What more do you want her to do? Sleep on the street just so you can finally feel secure?" Leandro stood up, his face flushing with rage, reminding Dario who owned the company. Dario agreed to draft the memo, but explicitly warned Leandro that he would be saving copies of every single written directive. For the first time, Leandro recognized that his CFO was no longer just disagreeing with him. He was actively documenting evidence to protect himself from his boss's reckless madness. The fake payroll memo was intentionally left inside an audit folder on Nuria's desk. Inez found it while reviewing severance calculations. She read the document slowly, realizing that hundreds of working-class families were about to lose their income. She didn't scream, cry, or rush into Leandro's office. She simply closed the door, sat in silence for a few long moments, and began calculating the absolute bare minimum cost of living for the company's most vulnerable employees. She called Leandro and asked him to meet her back at the estate. When Leandro arrived, he braced himself for a dramatic meltdown. Instead, Inez met him in the dining room with a simple notebook filled with precise figures, budget cutbacks, and affordable housing options. She calmly proposed that they immediately vacate the Westchester estate, put all the luxury furniture up for auction, and relocate to a modest 2-bedroom apartment she still owned in a working-class neighborhood in New Jersey. The apartment was completely paid off, small and unglamorous, but it was secure. She suggested using every single dollar raised from liquidating their personal lifestyle to cover employee payroll. Leandro listened in absolute silence, stunned by her proposal. Inez was standing there, fully prepared to walk away from a life of immense privilege, without demanding a single thing for herself. "I don't need a massive estate to be your wife, Leandro," Inez said, looking around the grand room that had never truly felt like a home to her. "But I need to know that the man I married isn't going to let 400 families drown just to preserve his own vanity. Her words sliced right through his web of lies, striking at the core of his deep insecurity. He asked her if she was genuinely prepared to live in a modest apartment without private drivers, designer wardrobes, or access to high society events. Inez looked at him with profound clarity. She reminded him that she had lived a simple life long before she met him, and she had never considered luxury essential to her self-worth. Then she added a quiet warning that made Leandro's blood run cold. If this company is failing because of honest market shifts, I will stand right beside you and work every single day to help us rebuild, Inez stated softly. But if this company is falling apart because of fraud or gross negligence, I will not lie for you, and I will not help you hide from the law. My loyalty means I will share your poverty, Leandro, but it does not mean I will share your corruption. Leandro dropped his gaze, entirely unable to look her in the eye. Without realizing it, Inez had just drawn the precise moral boundary that he was currently violating. After Inez left the room, Leandro locked himself in his study, staring blankly at old photographs from their wedding day. He began replaying their entire relationship in his mind, questioning how many times he had mistaken her calm, unmaterialistic nature for quiet, calculated manipulation. He remembered the day she had firmly turned down a prenuptial agreement clause that offered her a massive cash settlement in the event of a divorce, stating simply that she didn't want money to ever be a factor in their marriage. He recalled how she had once publicly stood up for a young waitress who was being verbally abused by an arrogant investor at a corporate dinner. Those memories should have been more than enough to earn his total trust. But Mireya's toxic whispers had systematically twisted every single one of those noble actions into suspect behavior. Leandro reached for his phone, finally determined to call Dario and call off the secret test once and for all. But before he could place the call, an automated security alert flashed on his laptop screen. The corporate IT system had just flagged an unauthorized remote login attempt into Montalban Design's restricted file server. The IP address was traced directly to the executive suite at the JFK Airport Hotel where Mireya was staying. His suspicions regarding his mistress instantly skyrocketed. Yet, instead of immediately coming clean to Inez, Leandro's flawed logic took over once again. He convinced himself that he needed to delay his confession just a little longer so he could fully uncover the extent of Mireya's corporate espionage before revealing the truth to his wife. It was a pathetic rationalization, but it allowed him to postpone the deeply embarrassing humiliation of admitting his cruel experiment to Inez. Back at headquarters, the fake payroll memo had leaked. A distressed office worker had taken a picture of the document and shared it in an employee group chat, setting off a massive wave of panic. Two senior textile designers immediately tendered their resignations, a key plant manager accepted a job offer from a direct competitor, and union representatives began preparing formal complaints with the Department of Labor. Dario frantically tried to contain the fallout, but the line between the staged crisis and real-world destruction was completely blurred. When he reported the escalating chaos to Leandro, Leandro foolishly suggested offering secret financial guarantees to their top executive talent to prevent them from leaving. Dario flatly refused to categorize human beings into who was valuable and who was expendable. The terror felt by a janitor who can't pay rent is no different than the terror felt by a senior vice president, Leandro, Dario said, his voice dripping with disdain. Leandro accused Dario of being overly dramatic, insisting that everything would be fixed the moment he announced the fake crisis was over. But as Leandro walked down the hallway, he overheard a tearful cleaning staff member telling a co-worker that she had just canceled her daughter's much-needed dental surgery because she couldn't risk depleting her tiny emergency savings. The woman's trembling voice echoed in his head for the rest of the day, rendering him completely unable to focus. Inez spent that entire afternoon tirelessly hunting for practical solutions. She successfully negotiated with a regional grocery chain to provide emergency food vouchers for struggling staff, convinced a local legal aid society to offer free financial counseling to the workforce, and reviewed employee health insurance policies to ensure no workers' medical coverage lapsed during the chaos. She wasn't acting like an elite corporate executive's wife trying to save face. She was acting like a grounded person who knew how to solve real problems under pressure. Her tireless dedication earned her immense respect from line workers who had previously viewed her as just another distant figure of wealth. Yet, as Inez sat in her improvised office late that evening, holding the pawnshop receipt for her grandmother's watch, a heavy wave of sadness washed over her. The loss of the watch hurt deeply, but what hurt far more was the growing, unsettling feeling that her husband was keeping her in the dark. Nerea walked into the room carrying a stack of internal accounting ledgers. She pointed out a series of strange financial anomalies she had just discovered. While several operational accounts were completely frozen, a hidden corporate reserve fund was actively receiving massive cash transfers. The source of the money wasn't incoming client payments. It was coming directly from subsidiary holding companies owned entirely by the Montalban family. Furthermore, the luxury vehicles that were supposedly seized by creditors were listed in official state records as simply being temporarily transferred to a fleet management company managed by Darío Cifuentes. Nerea looked at Inez with deep concern. "Inez, none of this looks like a sudden bankruptcy," Nerea whispered. "It looks like an intentional asset-shielding scheme." Inez felt her stomach drop. The idea that her husband might be committing corporate fraud to hide assets while his workers panicked was horrifying. She immediately marched into Dario's office to demand answers. Darío met Inez with his office blinds drawn tight and his personal phone switched off. Inez laid the transfer receipts, vehicle registration documents, and account ledgers directly on his desk. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked him to explain why innocent working-class families were being put through living hell for a financial collapse that didn't actually exist on paper. Darío stared at the documents, buried his face in his hands, and finally broke his silence. He admitted that Montalban Designs was completely solvent. He confessed that Leandro had ordered the artificial asset freezes, the luxury vehicle transfers, and the deliberate spreading of insolvency rumors. However, he refused to reveal the underlying personal motive, claiming he had believed he was assisting in a brief, harmless internal exercise until the situation spiraled completely out of control. Inez stared at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Was Leandro looking for an embezzler inside the company? Darío looked away, unable to meet her eyes. There is a real betrayal happening, Inez. But that isn't why he started this. Teeth. That single sentence exposed a truth far more painful than any corporate crime. Inez instantly understood that the origin of this elaborate disaster wasn't financial. It was personal. It was about her. Before she left his office, Darío urged her not to confront Leandro just yet. He explained that IT had caught Mireia illegally downloading proprietary client lists and trade secrets from her hotel room, and they needed a few more hours to secure the digital trail before Mireia could destroy the evidence. Inez agreed to hold off, prioritizing the safety of the company's workforce over her own personal pain, even though her trust in both men was utterly shattered. Darío brought up a digital audit log showing Mireia's remote network activity. The data proved that within hours of leaving the Westchester estate with her ivory suitcase, Mireya had systematically copied core design blueprints, pricing structures, and confidential account databases. Inez remembered Mireya walking down the grand staircase, pretending to be utterly heartbroken over her mother's sudden illness. Her dramatic departure hadn't been an act of fear. It had been the opening move of a cold, calculated corporate theft. The cruel irony was staggering. The fake crisis Leandro had constructed to test his wife's devotion had directly enabled an actual, massive betrayal by his mistress. Yet, Mireya's criminality did not make Leandro any less guilty. He had willingly weaponized the fears of his wife and his employees for a sick psychological experiment. That evening, Mireya returned to the city with a rehearsed story. She called Leandro, claiming she had successfully engaged a major private equity firm interested in providing a bailout for Montalban Designs. She claimed her quick departure from the estate was a strategic move to negotiate freely without drawing media scrutiny. Eager to find any excuse to validate his choices, Leandro agreed to meet her at his private city office. Mireya arrived wearing conservative attire, carrying a slick portfolio of investment proposals fabricated entirely from the trade secrets she had stolen. She proposed that a third-party investor group inject emergency capital in exchange for controlling equity and direct access to Montalban's proprietary distribution channels. As she presented the numbers, Leandro recognized proprietary metrics that were only accessible to the top executive committee. He asked her point-blank where she had obtained those exact figures. Mireya smoothly lied, claiming she had reconstructed them from memory and past public filings. She placed her hand over his, whispering that she had returned to save him when everyone else had written him off. Leandro tried to believe her, but a dark realization was finally dawning on him. Mireya hadn't returned for a ruined man. She had returned to exploit a company she knew was secretly still worth millions. Inez quietly observed Mireya's arrival from across the glass hallway. She felt no jealousy, only a profound, cold clarity. The woman who had fled with the suitcase was now back with a team of corporate lawyers, vulture investors, and a fake rescue plan, waiting to profit from a manufactured crisis. Mireya quickly confirmed that one of the attorneys accompanying Mireya was a prominent senior partner who routinely represented Montalban Design's fiercest industry rival. Meanwhile, Dario successfully obtained security camera footage from the airport hotel restaurant, clearly showing Mireya handing an encrypted flash drive to executives from that rival firm. He also recovered deleted emails from her private account in which she offered to trade confidential client lists for an executive VP position, a lavish corporate housing allowance, and full legal indemnification. The evidence was more than enough to fire her immediately and file criminal charges, but Leandro hesitated. He claimed he wanted to hear her side of the story in full detail before making a formal move. Dario looked at his boss with pure disgust. "You never gave your own wife the benefit of the doubt, Leandro," Dario said coldly. "Yet you're giving a confirmed corporate spy endless chances to explain herself." Leandro flew into a rage, but he couldn't find a single logical sentence to defend his hypocrisy. While Leandro was arguing with Dario, Inez was quietly digging through old administrative backup files on the corporate server. She stumbled across a hidden folder titled Personal Contingency Scenario. The folder was password protected, but Mireya knew the access code because Mireya had used the same security phrase for past public relations campaigns. Inside the folder was a complete, step-by-step master plan of the entire crisis. It contained draft press releases, instructions for staged asset removals, lists of bank accounts to freeze, and a detailed timeline of expected reactions. The very first document was dated weeks before any financial news had broken. On the margin of the document, a handwritten note by Mireya read, "Expected reaction from IR, panic, immediate request for access to emergency funds, packing personal luggage, emergency call to divorce attorney." Inez read those initials, IR, over and over again. Inez Robledo. It hadn't been an operational strategy to catch an internal thief. It hadn't been a protective financial maneuver. Her husband had treated her like a laboratory rat in a sick psychological test. Below her name was a second column dedicated to Mireya, predicting that she would act as a loyal advisor and stay close to Leandro throughout the fake collapse. Real-world events had completely inverted their predictions, but the disgusting intent behind the experiment was laid bare. Mireya wanted to immediately call a criminal defense attorney, but Inez asked for a few moments alone. She walked into an empty conference room, closed the door, and sat in total darkness. She remembered every single interaction from the past 3 weeks. She recalled Leandro's strange, probing questions about the New Jersey apartment, his intense obsession with knowing if she could live without luxury, the cold manner in which he watched her hand over her grandmother's watch, and his total refusal to accept her help with the company ledgers. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place with brutal precision. He hadn't been protecting her from a corporate disaster. He had built a psychological cage to see how much pain she would endure before breaking. Inez pulled out the pawnshop receipt for her grandmother's watch. For the very first time since the ordeal began, she let her tears fall freely. She wasn't weeping over the loss of the jewelry. She was weeping because the man she loved had watched her sacrifice a priceless family heirloom, knowing full well it was completely unnecessary. He had allowed her to bleed emotionally just to measure her compliance. When she composed herself, Inez saved the entire personal contingency scenario folder onto a flash drive. She chose not to reveal her knowledge just yet, knowing she needed one final critical piece of evidence. She needed to know if Leandro had personally authorized the cruel parameters written by Mireya, or if Mireya had orchestrated the parameters on her own. Dario revealed that automated video recordings of their internal executive meetings were saved on a secure local server. Several files had been manually deleted, but the system administrator could recover them from an encrypted off-site backup if given formal authorization by the CFO. Dario hesitated, knowing that restoring those files would prove his own active participation in the scheme and destroy his executive career. Inez looked Dario dead in the eye. "Keeping quiet has already cost people their jobs, their health, and their sanity, Dario," she said quietly. "I am not asking you to save me. I am asking you to stop protecting a lie." Dario signed the release form. An hour later, the IT administrator recovered 3 clean audio-video files from the off-site server. Inez sat in a closed room with Mireya and Dario as the audio played through the speakers. Leandro's voice came through crystal clear. "I need to see who stays when the money, the estate, and the status vanish. I want to know if she loves me or the lifestyle." Then Mireya's voice played, "What if Inez tries to play the martyr and help the factory workers?" Leandro's recorded response was cold, cynical, and definitive. Even her generosity could just be a public relations strategy to protect her social standing. "I don't want promises. I want to see her lose her comforts and see if she still chooses me." Inez closed her eyes. There was no longer any room for excusing him. Leandro hadn't been tricked or manipulated by Mireya. He had knowingly, intentionally, turned his marriage into a sadistic loyalty test. Dario quickly stopped the playback, his face burning with intense shame. He admitted he was present during that meeting, claiming he had tried to tone down the plan and foolishly assumed Leandro would abort the experiment the moment real damage occurred. Inez looked at him with quiet devastation. "Why didn't you speak up when I sold my grandmother's watch, Dario?" she asked softly. Dario had no answer. Inez backed up the audio files in 3 separate locations, sending an encrypted copy to a trusted legal contact in New Jersey. Then she returned to the Westchester estate, acting as if nothing had changed. She found Leandro sitting in the formal dining room with 2 glasses and an expensive bottle of wine he had saved for their upcoming anniversary. He looked visibly relieved, boasting that he had secured new investor interest and that payroll was officially guaranteed. Then he looked at her and casually asked if she was still willing to move to the simple New Jersey apartment, if things took a turn for the worse. Inez looked at him, catching the tiny, victorious smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought she had passed his sick test. "I will move anywhere I need to, Leandro," Inez said calmly, "as long as it is necessary." Leandro reached out to take her hand, smiling, as he said that she would soon understand why he had to keep certain secrets from her. Inez gently pulled her hand away from his grip. "I certainly hope your explanation is worth the immense damage you've caused," she replied softly. The following morning at 9 o'clock, the main executive boardroom at Montalban Designs was packed to capacity. In attendance were senior board members, union representatives, labor attorneys, and a delegation of factory workers. Leandro sat at the head of the long conference table, attempting to maintain his usual aura of total corporate control. To his right sat Dario, pale and rigid. To his left was an empty chair reserved for Mireia, who had been formally summoned to address the trade secret leaks. Inez walked into the room alongside Mireia. She wore a simple, unadorned business suit, carried no luxury accessories, and sat directly across from her husband. Leandro opened the meeting by announcing that emergency funding had been secured and that all pending worker paychecks would be cleared by the end of the day. He paused, clearly expecting a round of applause or visible relief. The room remained dead silent. The workers didn't want corporate speeches. They wanted to know why they had been subjected to days of severe psychological torment. Leandro attempted to reframe the entire situation. He claimed the perceived insolvency was a high-level, highly classified operational stress test designed to identify internal security vulnerabilities, protect corporate assets, and expose an internal spy selling information to competitors. He presented the manufactured disaster as an unpleasant but necessary corporate maneuver to safeguard the long-term future of Montalban Designs. Several board members nodded along cautiously, eager to accept any narrative that protected the company's stock value. Inez listened quietly until Leandro asserted that no actual harm had been done to any individual. At that moment, she reached into her bag and placed 3 items directly on the center of the table: the pawn shop receipt for her grandmother's watch, a list of canceled vendor contracts, and a certified medical report for a factory worker who had suffered a severe panic attack due to impending eviction. "Did these real-world consequences also serve as part of your strategic stress test, Leandro?" Inez asked, her voice echoing clearly across the boardroom. Leandro stammered, claiming all financial losses would be fully reimbursed, but his confident posture began to crumble. Inez pointed out that while money could replace lost wages, it could never erase the agonizing nights 400 working-class families spent wondering how they were going to feed their children. Dario then stood up, opened his briefcase, and addressed the board directly. He formally confessed that Montalban Designs had never been anywhere near insolvency. He revealed that he had executed asset transfers, frozen operational accounts, and deliberately leaked false rumors strictly under direct orders from Leandro. He took full legal responsibility for his compliance and handed out signed copies of every written directive Leandro had issued. A chaotic roar of indignation broke out across the room. A union representative slammed his fist on the table, demanding to know what possible corporate justification existed for such gross misconduct. Dario looked directly at Leandro, his voice steady and unforgiving. "It wasn't a corporate strategy," Dario revealed. "The entire crisis was manufactured for a personal reason. Leandro wanted to see who would stay by his side if his money, his estate, and his power completely vanished." The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Every head turned slowly toward Inez. The entire board suddenly understood that 400 workers had been used as pawns in a billionaire's sick marital loyalty test. Before Leandro could respond, the boardroom door burst open. Mireia walked in, flanked by a high-powered defense attorney. She aggressively claimed that Dario was fabricating evidence to cover up his own financial incompetence and accused Inez of using the internal chaos to stage a corporate coup. Her attorney presented a fraudulent portfolio, claiming Mireia had been acting as an undercover operative to catch rival firms in act of industrial espionage. Mireia immediately projected Mireia's private emails onto the large wall screens. The room watched in real time as her explicit demands for $1 million salary, an executive apartment, and legal immunity in exchange for stolen client databases were displayed for everyone to see. Mireia turned ghost white. Dario then displayed the high-resolution security photos from the airport hotel restaurant, alongside digital forensic logs proving Mireia had downloaded the stolen files just hours after fleeing the estate with her ivory suitcase. Realizing she was completely trapped, Mireia abandoned all pretense of corporate innocence. She pointed a trembling finger at Leandro, shouting that he was the mastermind who had devised the entire scheme. She revealed that Leandro had explicitly instructed her to help him put Inez to the test, promising that whichever woman proved true loyalty would be rewarded with his permanent commitment. She openly confessed to their multi-month affair right in front of the entire corporate board, detailing private meetings, expensive gifts, and explicit promises Leandro had made to her. Leandro frantically denied her claims, but Mireia pulled out her phone and began reading private text messages aloud. Messages in which Leandro casually mocked his wife's simple lifestyle and expressed deep suspicion over her motives. Inez sat completely still, watching the dramatic collapse with quiet, heartbreaking dignity. The public exposure of her husband's infidelity was deeply painful, but it was no longer the deepest wound. The deepest wound was realizing that the man she had loved had treated her character as something to be audited and judged by a dishonest mistress. Desperate to restore order, Leandro demanded an immediate executive recess. The union representatives flatly refused, stating they would not leave until the complete truth was documented. Inez stood up, connected her flash drive to the room's media system, and pressed play. The clear, unedited audio recording of Leandro's voice filled the high-ceilinged room. "I don't want promises. I want to see her lose her comforts and see if she still chooses me." The room listened as Mireia's recorded voice suggested staged asset seizures, and Dario's recorded voice warned of severe collateral damage. When the audio finished, an overwhelming silence blanketed the boardroom. No further legal arguments were necessary. The absolute moral bankruptcy of Leandro Montalban was laid entirely bare. Inez looked at her husband and asked quietly, "Are you still going to pretend this was about saving the company, Leandro?" Leandro stood up, completely ignoring the rolling security cameras and the furious stares of his board members. He walked around the long table toward Inez, his voice trembling with genuine panic. He admitted he had made a terrible mistake, but desperately pleaded that his fear of being used had been real. He spoke frantically about his father's deathbed warnings, about former business partners who had cheated him in his youth, and about his lifelong terror that people only loved him for his family name. He swore that he loved Inez deeply, and that the test was born out of a desperate, broken need to be certain of her love. Inez looked at him with profound sadness. "An old wound might explain your fear, Leandro," she said softly, "but it does not give you the right to turn innocent human beings into collateral damage just to soothe your insecurity." She reminded him that he had endless opportunities to stop the madness. When Mireia walked out with her suitcase, when major clients began canceling contracts, when factory workers wept in the lobby, or when she offered her own life savings to save payroll. "You didn't stop because you weren't looking for the truth, Leandro," Inez said, her voice steady and clear. "You were looking for absolute submission. You wanted to see me suffer enough to make you feel like a king." Leandro reached out to grasp her hands, but Inez took a slow step backward. That tiny, physical retreat echoed louder than any scream. A senior factory mechanic from the Scranton plant stood up. With a quiet, trembling voice, he described how his family had spent 3 sleepless nights wondering how they would afford rent, and how his co-worker had been forced to cancel a vital medical procedure for her child. One by one, working-class men and women spoke up, putting real human faces to the numbers Leandro had treated as meaningless game pieces. Leandro couldn't hold their gaze. Every single word dismantled his fragile self-justifications. The executive board convened an emergency vote right then and there. Leandro was officially suspended from his position as chief executive officer, pending a full external audit and Department of Labor investigation. Dario was placed on administrative leave under strict supervision, while Nerea was appointed to lead an emergency worker oversight committee. Leandro retained his equity shares, but his operational control over Montalban Designs was stripped away entirely. The man who had manufactured a fake loss of power was now experiencing absolute, real-world powerlessness. When the boardroom finally cleared, Leandro tried to speak to Inez alone. He desperately offered to transfer a massive block of company stock directly into her name, buy back her grandmother's watch at any cost, and single-handedly fund her charitable initiatives. Inez looked at him with quiet, unshakable boundary. "Do not confuse attempting to buy your way out of damage with earning forgiveness from the person you destroyed, Leandro," she warned softly. That evening, the Westchester estate was enveloped in an eerie, absolute silence. Inez walked upstairs to the master bedroom, pulled her old, worn suitcase down from the top closet shelf, and set it on the bed. The suitcase was light, simple, and slightly dusty. The exact same luggage she had brought with her when they were first married years ago. Leandro stood in the doorway, his face pale with a raw, desperate terror he could no longer hide. He asked if she was really going to end their marriage over a single mistake. Inez quietly packed a few simple outfits, her personal legal documents, and a small framed photograph of her late mother. She looked up at him with devastating clarity. "I am not leaving because of a single lie, Leandro," she said softly. "I am leaving because of everything that lie revealed about your heart. You didn't trust my word. You felt entitled to manipulate my life, and you thought it was acceptable to crush innocent people just to test my devotion." Leandro begged her to stay, arguing that she had passed his test and proven her ultimate loyalty. Inez stopped packing and looked at him with utter disbelief. "That is the core of your sickness, Leandro," she said quietly. "You still think I was supposed to pass a test." She pointed out that Mireia had run away, while she had stayed. But Inez firmly stated that she refused to be viewed as a winner in a sick competition she never agreed to enter. Leandro fell to his knees beside the bed, confessing his deep brokenness, promising to step down permanently, and offering to hand over everything he owned. Inez reached down, gently touching his shoulder, but her decision remained absolute. She told him that taking accountability was a basic moral requirement, not a bargaining chip to buy back her presence. "I stayed when I thought you had lost everything, Leandro," Inez whispered, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "I am leaving now, because I finally see what you were willing to destroy, just to prove a point." Before closing her suitcase, Inez took off her house keys, her corporate access cards, and her high-end jewelry, leaving them neatly on the nightstand. She did not take off her wedding ring just yet, refusing to turn her departure into a grand dramatic show like the ones he created. She left behind only the items that represented luxury, status, and dependency. She zipped her suitcase shut. The sharp, crisp sound of the zipper pulling closed was identical to the sound that had echoed through the house weeks earlier. But this time, Leandro experienced no cynical satisfaction, only the crushing, permanent weight of true loss. Inez walked down the grand staircase, stepped out into the cool evening air, and got into a modest taxi Nerea had arranged for her. She didn't look back. She wasn't fleeing from creditors, hiding from the law, or seeking luxury elsewhere. She was simply walking away to reclaim her dignity. The public fallout over the next few months was swift and uncompromising. Leandro appeared at a formal press conference without public relations advisors or prepared corporate scripts. Standing alongside union representatives, he publicly confessed to manufacturing the fake insolvency, took total personal responsibility for the emotional and financial harm inflicted on his workforce, and announced his temporary withdrawal from all corporate operations. The confession triggered a massive media storm. Montalban Design's stock took an immediate hit. Several major retail partners severed ties, and business publications condemned Leandro's toxic leadership. However, because the company was fundamentally solvent, emergency financial reserves were successfully redirected to cover worker compensation, restore canceled benefits, and establish an independent labor oversight board. Leandro pledged a significant portion of his personal wealth to fund a multi-million-dollar employee trust, permanently waiving his corporate bonuses for 5 years. Dario resigned from his executive position, but at the explicit request of the labor union, he agreed to stay on temporarily to assist the independent auditors in restructuring the company's financial controls. He accepted full accountability for his compliance, routinely meeting with affected workers, and enduring their justified anger without making excuses. Mireia faced severe legal consequences. The evidence of trade secret theft and corporate espionage resulted in a high-profile civil lawsuit and formal criminal charges. Stripped of her executive status, her elite social connections, and her corporate housing, she quickly learned that the very people she had courted abandoned her the moment her leverage vanished. Inez relocated to a quiet, working-class coastal town in New Jersey, moving into the modest 2-bedroom apartment she had kept for years. She resolutely turned down dozens of lucrative media offers to sell her story, refusing to transform her personal pain into cheap tabloid entertainment. She opened a small, nonprofit community advocacy center called Open Door, utilizing her administrative skills to provide free legal aid, financial literacy counseling, and emergency support for working-class women and struggling families facing housing insecurity. Leandro did not attempt to force his way back into her life. Instead, he began attending intensive personal therapy, slowly confronting the deep-seated paranoia and toxic legacy left behind by his father. He sent regular, quiet updates to Inez's legal counsel detailing the structural changes being made at the company and the progress of the Worker Trust Fund, never demanding a reply or asking for a second chance. 6 months later, Leandro attended a regional conference on ethical corporate management where Inez was scheduled to speak about worker advocacy. He sat quietly in the back row, wearing a simple suit, without an entourage or media presence. He listened intently as Inez spoke about the fundamental dignity of labor and the dangerous moral vacuum created when corporate leaders view human beings as mere statistics or testing tools. After the panel concluded, they met outside near the quiet coastal boardwalk. There were no grand romantic gestures, no expensive gifts, and no dramatic pleas. They simply walked along the wooden pier, talking quietly about the recovery of the manufacturing plants, the success of her community center, and the long, slow process of personal healing. Leandro offered a quiet, deeply sincere apology, one that didn't demand an immediate resolution or seek to lessen his guilt. He admitted that he finally understood that trust cannot be demanded through tests or bought with wealth. It can only be built through consistent, quiet integrity and total respect for another person's freedom. Inez looked out at the ocean, her grandmother's vintage watch resting comfortably on her wrist. She didn't offer an immediate promise to rebuild their marriage, nor did she close the door in anger. She acknowledged his honest progress, agreed to continue communicating through therapy, and stated that whatever the future held, it would be built on complete mutual respect rather than fear. They parted ways that evening under the soft dusk light, walking in separate directions, but carrying a quiet peace that had been absent for years. True human connection is never forged in the cold, calculated furnace of suspicion, nor can love ever be accurately measured by manufactured hardship. When we construct artificial trials to test the devotion of those around us, we do not expose their weakness. We merely reveal the profound brokenness within our own hearts. Wealth, status, and authority can purchase temporary compliance, dramatic declarations, and hollow loyalty, but they remain entirely powerless to buy genuine affection or unshakable integrity. A person's true moral character is never proven by how much abuse or humiliation they are willing to endure to stay by our side. It is revealed in their quiet refusal to abandon their core values when everything around them crumbles. Real trust requires the immense courage to render ourselves vulnerable without demanding absolute guarantees, to accept people as free individuals rather than assets to be audited, and to understand that the highest form of love is one that honors dignity above control. In the end, those who attempt to measure devotion through cruelty will only ever succeed in driving away the very hearts they were so desperately afraid of losing, while those who walk with humility learn that love is not a prize to be won through a test, but a sacred gift to be cherished in freedom.